we're here at Web Summit where Professor Richard Werner has just given a great talk about decentral banking. He's here, and we've got Dr. Makoto Takemiya, who is working with SORAMITSU on a Japanese fintech. So we're going to be speaking a bit about the decentral banking system and how we can help to bring the power back to local communities in credit creation and monetary theory. So like you said in your talk, it's very important to think about all financial technology not as a specific end goal, but a tool in reaching a normatively good conclusion that we can all agree on. So maybe you could speak a bit about how credit creation can be harnessed for good rather than evil.
Right, yes, thank you very much. Everyone wants economic growth, and certainly for politicians, the optimal result that they can really only dream about is when you have high economic growth, full employment, stability, no crises, no inflation. That's sort of the nirvana for any government and of course the population. Everyone would love that. So why aren't we getting it? My work shows that this is possible. We can achieve this. But the trouble is the monetary system hasn't been used properly to achieve that. Now that may be various reasons. Institutional, structural, partly maybe intentional. There may be other goals. Maybe some people don't actually want to achieve that. But the point is, if we have the right monetary system, we can achieve it. There's no reason why we shouldn't achieve it. Also, perhaps just briefly mentioning, because nowadays some people are slightly averse to hearing about economic growth. We have a movement there saying, oh no, we should have zero growth, we should have degrowth because it's bad for the environment. That's a big misunderstanding. Because economic growth is not actually a physical sort of thing that you can measure in terms of laws of physics and thermodynamics. It's a statistical concept. And statistical concepts don't harm the environment, believe me. It is harmful activities and pollution and destruction of the environment that harms the environment, and that you can have at zero growth, at negative growth. In fact, my contention is when you have no growth, and when you have negative growth, the pressures in society, because the social constructs we've created are such that when this happens, there's unemployment, there's no prosperity, the pressures are on. Nobody's going to care about the environment. We've already seen it recently. Everyone going back now to coal-powered energy and things like that. Why? Well, because they're not getting the sequence right. You need high growth, which is sustainable and environmentally friendly, and that can easily be done in order to afford looking after the environment and also making sure that you can look after everyone. So growth is not the enemy of the environment. It's actually an ally. And so, just to make clear first, growth and prosperity is a good thing. So how can we achieve it? Well, we need the right monetary system. And the principles are very, very simple. Growth means, and as I said, it's a statistical concept. It means we have, national income accounting. We have more transactions this year than last year. And in our current system, this is only possible if banks have created more money for transactions this year than last year. So you need money creation. Growth means money creation. Without money creation, you won't have growth. That, by the way, is another reason why when they talk about, let's get rid of banks, let's just have one centralized, controlled digital currency without banks. You won't have money creation. You won't have economic growth, and that's the end of prosperity. And maybe that's why some people want to talk about zero growth as some kind of environmental justification, because if we centralize the system so much, then that's what we're going to get, zero growth. So we don't want that. That's a disaster. So how can we get this high and sustainable growth? Well, we need money creation. How should the money be created? Well, the Soviet Union had an answer to that. The central planners love it when they can do the central planning and the centralized money creation. In the Soviet Union, there was only one bank, certainly throughout certain time periods, one bank, Gosbank, and it was the only one that created money and allocated the resources. Now, the Soviet system, I think we all agree, was not very successful. And a key example here is China. When the Chinese leadership changed and Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978, he decided the Soviet centralized system is not good enough, it's not delivering. Neighboring country, Japan, was doing extremely well. He went over there, he looked at it, and, well, he found out, he was told by the Japanese, they're always very honest, they tell you the truth, particularly after hours in the evening with a bit of sake. You will hear the full truth. It's off the record, but you will hear it. So that's how I think he found out. He needs banks. So he went back and he created thousands of banks, community banks, local banks, savings banks, regional banks, and they lend for productive business investment, and then you get growth without inflation. And so that is a very important way to get growth and prosperity, to set up small local community banks if they have the right incentive structure. And the best is when they're regionally restricted to only lend in their area. You know, in Spain, where they also had a good decentralized banking system, under EU pressure, they had to abolish all the rules there. And then they forced the many small local savings banks to compete against each other in far-flung places, and they started lending for property in places, 600 kilometers away or more. They had no clue about it. And of course, what you get is excess bank credit, not for productive purposes. You get speculation, and in the end, they went bust. So the regional principle is very important. So if you have community banks regionally restricted lending to their local area, you get local money creation. You can ensure that it's accountable to local people, that it's productive and not wasteful. Then you get your high growth. So that's one avenue that I'm strongly recommending.
So thanks very much. I think we can all agree that we want a decentralized decision-making and that we're in favor of growth. So the question now is, how do we get there? And I think that might be where fintech comes in. And I'm sure Dr. Takemiya has many insightful thoughts about what SORA have been doing to try and develop that.
Well, yeah. So it seems to me that Richard's work is really mainly about governance. So creating money in itself is not bad. It's really what you do with it and how you allocate it. So it's a problem of governance. And to me, that's really what things like DAOs can help solve. And so Valhalla DAO is doing this at a regulated banking level. And then SORA is doing this or trying to do it at the cryptocurrency level. So it's a little bit more nuanced, of course, in SORA. So crypto investors or crypto users, they don't really like the idea of increasing the token supply. So there's a they call this inflation, even though it's not really inflation. So it's a little bit silly. So what we do in SORA is we create what's called a token bonding curve, which is a predictable smart contract that you can only mint new tokens based on some reserve asset. But in order to have productive allocation of money, of new purchasing power in the SORA economy, we have another token that is actually mintable by governance. And this token is convertible to ZOR, XOR, the main SORA token, but it's limited by liquidity on the markets. So it does help a little bit with the potential sell pressure that you would have on the token, because unlike fiat currencies, cryptocurrencies are not used as legal tender widely. There's only El Salvador and Central African Republic currently that are using Bitcoin, which is, I mean, you know my thoughts about it. So it's Bitcoin is just like the US dollar. It's a foreign currency to the government. They can't mint it, and they can't allocate it because they can't mint it. So they'd have to buy it, and it crowds out existing purchasing power that they have. But in SORA, what we want to do is actually target developing countries and get them to use ZOR as a legal tender. And then the idea would be that there would be some high-level. So I know you don't like central planning, but if you study the history of Mantetsu, the Manchurian Railway in Japan, they did high-level sectoral planning based on the principle of the right activity in the right location. So like some locations have bauxite ore, and you can make aluminum, you can do the different things like that. So really, the idea is that we would have some kind of high-level plan that the community would approve. So the government would, or somebody at the central bank would make this plan, approve it, and then allocate money to regional offices, and then the regional offices would allocate the money to businesses, either as grants or loans. So that's kind of the basic idea of what we want to do. And so we're actually talking to several small countries to try to pitch this idea. We'll see if we're successful. But the advantage over something like Bitcoin is instead of not being able to mint tokens, they can actually mint this token XST, and then that's convertible to SOR, and then that can fund new business activity in the economy.
Great, and of course, we know that Professor Werner is an expert on governance, and he knows that you need localized decision making. So maybe I would like to get your thoughts on how you could potentially use the crowdsourcing of knowledge or smaller high-tech information sourcing to improve the decision making of SMEs. You spoke a lot about how SMEs and small banks can be just as competitive as bulge bracket banks if they have the correct technology. So how would you say that is best harnessed?
Yes, yeah. And actually, thank you for the question. That links quite nicely to what Makoto was saying. And you know, I'm familiar with Mantetsu, the essentially Japanese-run South Manchurian Railway, which had a research department, did some interesting research, and that became, you know, the research there became the blueprint for how the Manchurian economy is run, and it was highly successful. Now, I wouldn't actually call that central planning. Of course, there was, in a sense, a central institution doing planning. However, they themselves didn't consider themselves like, say, a Soviet-style central planner, and the type of central planning that happened, maybe that's where we need to distinguish different types, was the decentralized type of central planning, where, as you mentioned, as much as possible of the decision-making is delegated to the lowest principal. And I looked into the background there, and that goes all the way back. The Japanese got this from Germany, and Germany got it from Prussia. It goes back to the Prussian army and the principle of subsidiarity, which Prussia introduced already in 1812. You know, the Prussian armies were highly successful, and the key principle was that while of course there were standard, you know, army hierarchies, they had this key difference to all the neighboring armies, that the officer in the field would be given a task, a goal to achieve, but would not be told how to do it. The officer and his people on the ground could figure this out themselves and be flexible, because in the fog of war, you know, their presumption was actually it's chaotic, things are changing all the time. Only the officer in the field at the front line can make the right decisions. There's no point in having central planning telling exactly, you know, the officer how to do X, Y, Z. Now, other armies, including in the First World War, the British Army, Second World War, American Army, they still had this centralized control system, whereas the German Army had the decentralized one. And I think that's the key. So decentralization, and that's, of course, also your question. So by giving autonomy to the local level, to the local banks, and the same actually in the local firms, you know, by being able to thrive in a local area, you don't have to go to the big central, you know, capital of the country. You can be, you know, regionally decentralized. You can thrive there because there's a local bank. There's job creation there. That's where the locals will be able to figure out what is best for them, and then they're empowered to apply it. And by the way, this is very much in line with the so-called corporate principle, which, of course, the majority of banks in Europe are based on, and the majority of those are German cooperative banks. There's 1,000 of them. The principle is self-administration, self-responsibility, local decision-making, where people are empowered to take charge. And I think that also applies to any technological challenge and also fundraising challenges. The more you decentralize of decision-making to the local level, the better. Now, of course, you need some kind of coordination just to make sure that a common goal is achieved. But the point is, the actual day-to-day decision-making is decentralized.
Right. Well, that's a great overview of the rich European history of decentralized decision-making. Unfortunately, I guess with the modern European Central Bank, there's slightly a more pessimistic tone to be struck. So as you said, SORA has been looking further afield, particularly to Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific. So maybe we go to the good news first, and then we get the pessimistic take from Professor Werner to top it off. Right, so please.
Well, I think you mean probably in the topic of CBDCs. So my company SORAMITSU works with a couple of central banks in Southeast Asia, and we built a system in Cambodia that is a retail and wholesale CBDC. And yeah, this is a very interesting topic because wholesale CBDCs have some good advantages. I mean, it's similar to RTGS systems in a way. But it does allow you to incorporate central bank money in computer programs, and that can make things like PVP, DVP a little bit more efficient. Retail is interesting because if you do it in the wrong way, you could actually open up current accounts at the central bank to everyone in the country, and then there would be no need for a banking system anymore, which is quite an interesting topic. And if you read the publications put out by the BIS, they really are very interested in this area as well, and programmable money. And one central bank I talked to as well, they like the concept of CBDC because of programmable money, because specifically for allocation of loans, once a commercial bank gets a plan from the central bank, it's kind of a smaller country, so they don't have good control. Then the commercial bank typically just uses the money not as planned, but like for some kind of asset investments just to make more money. And this is a problem that the regulator has trouble enforcing. So if you do have something like a programmable CBDC, you can of course control how this money is allocated. So, which is a double-edged sword in many ways, yeah.
Exactly. In fact, maybe if I can just comment on that. And of course, the truth is that there is an alternative through which central banks can coordinate well bank credit. This is known in East Asia as window guidance. And that's when the central bank is actually asked to perform and to deliver high growth without inflation and without crises. Then they can use window guidance, which is actually this combination of a bit of central control, but then decentralization. The money creation takes place still by banks, but the banks are told how much money to create. They can also be told which sectors. So the central bank could easily say no lending for asset purchases, no lending for consumption, only for productive business investment. But the central banks have not been doing that, because they love these asset bubbles and banking crises that give them more power. You know, we're in an era of regulatory moral hazard where the central bankers get more power each time they create another banking crisis. So they love it. And that's why we get more of them. If we held them to account and told them, no, your job is to deliver low inflation, high and sustainable economic growth without crises, and if you don't do that, you all lose your jobs. So you'd see how quickly we'd get that high and stable growth, because it's possible and they can use window guidance. But now they've turned this thing around because they love, of course, CBDCs, because it gives them even more power and more centralized control, and it would get rid of banks. And therefore, it's a totalitarian world, a dystopian world where the central banker decides everything. So that's not the principle of delegation, that's not the principle of subsidiarity, and that is the Soviet principle, which doesn't really work well. So they love that, but how to sell it to the public? They say, oh, we have this problem that the banks are just lending for the wrong things. Well, why have they done that? Because the central planners have not given them the right incentive structure. Has any central bank in Europe asked the banks to lend mainly for productive purposes? Could easily enforce this with a window guidance mechanism, which actually was developed in Europe. You know, credit guidance, encadrement du crédit. The French did it until 1985. You could do it if you wanted to, but they didn't want to, you see, because they want to be able to argue, oh, now we need CBDCs and banks are bad. You know, since the 2008 crisis, the banks have been given this bad publicity, in the UK in particular, but many countries. Oh, the banks created it. Well, actually, the banks, you can't blame the bankers. And, you know, if you go through all my public speeches and my work, where have I criticized the banks per se as the ones ultimately responsible for these boom-bust cycles? No, they're just doing their job. It's the job of the regulators to make sure that money creation is used for productive purposes, and they didn't. They didn't ask banks to lend for productive purposes. That's why we had the crises. So the criticism should have really been at the central planners, not against the banks. And so we all have to make sure that they don't kill our banks, because the banks, that's our power. That's power of the people. If we have, the more small banks we have, the better. And if they get rid of those, that's the end. And so we have to be very careful there. And I think the best is to have decentralized systems, have alternatives, have different monetary systems and currencies. So there is competition. So the central planners always have to compete. Make them work for the money.
And on that happy note, I think we will leave it till next time. Thanks so much to both our speakers for having this brief moment here at the Web Summit. I would like to say that a credit-based economy is not always a bad thing. Sometimes trying to look for alternatives is always good, but we could be led down to fool's gold. So thanks very much. Yeah.